Hi, I'm trying my hardest to make this a shorter video. Your textbook covers this pretty well, with two exceptions that I'll get to in just a minute. So let me just start by kind of doing an overview. Um, we're talking about the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, or the ending of the slave trade, and the transition to what's known as the period of legitimate commerce. Legitimate meaning legal commerce in particularly West Africa in the 19th century. And I think it's illustrated pretty well this graph. You see a peak of the Atlantic slave trade sometime 1790 or so, about 1800, and then a slow decline over the next 60, 70 years or so. At the same time, you see a huge increase in the commodity trade. And that's the trade of exports from Africa of non-people, okay, non-slave commodities, mostly raw materials and natural products. And we'll get to what some of those are in just a minute here. It's a time of tremendous change in West Africa and West Central Africa. But as I said, there's two things in your textbook that I think they're wrong about. So anyway, let me get to that here in just a minute. A few overall points. Once again, your textbook covers this, but I just want to lay this out. The abolition of the Atlantic slave trade takes place over a period of time, okay, from about 1807 with the British to about 1866. As such, this is a process, not an event. All right? It takes decades. Not surprisingly, because the Atlantic slave trade as a system took centuries to develop. Okay? This is also the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, not of slavery itself. That's going to be a separate issue, especially in the Americas. The British outlawed slavery effectively in 1838, but of course, hopefully you know, in the United States, it's not effective until 1865. So it's going to be different times in different places. Britain will lead the way for this. And then the big question we always ask is why? And that's particularly important, I think, in the case of the British, because if you take a look at this table here, you look at slaves carried across the Atlantic by Great Britain, and from 1726 to 1800, they are the number one slave trading nation in the world. They are carrying more slave people into slavery than anybody else. And then just a few years later, they declare it to be illegal. Well, why would they do that? You'll see explanations that talk about economic factors and this and that and so on. Most of those are wrong, so I won't get into much detail there. So really it comes down to a humanitarian or human rights campaign. It was the first real global human rights campaign. And it's led by, you're going to see a hopefully short piece of video, 4 minutes or so long, that I linked for you there. It talks about the British did this, the British did this. But, as your textbook says, it's Africans and African Americans who are really leading the way, including enslaved Africans, rising up against slavery in Haiti, a little earlier in Jamaica, and freed slaves also who become abolitionists. So they're going to be aided by especially evangelical Protestants in England and the U.S. who are going to lead the way. So it really was an incredible event or process, really, I guess, for the British to be the number one slave trading nation and then just years later declare it to be illegal. So a pretty incredible story all the way around. This is another graph that kind of shows the peaks of the slave trade around 1800 or so, and then this precipitous drop off here. All right. Now, this happens at the same time as the rise of industrial capitalism, also primarily in England. What does that mean? Well, industrial capitalism is pretty much what it says. Capitalism based on industry, factory production, and transport based on power. Initially steam power, or water power, and then steam power. That's important, and the growth of industry is important because it's going to change the relationship between the Western countries and Africa. Instead of looking at Africa as a source of labor, as they had done for centuries, they're going to look at Africa as a source of raw materials and a potential source for the manufactured goods they're going to produce. The number one item is going to be cloth. Okay, textile manufacturing is going to be very important. So the argument basically is keep Africans in Africa producing the raw materials we need for industry and as a market for our manufactured goods. Okay, this then ushers in what's known as the era of legitimate commerce in especially West Africa. African exports of non-slave goods, primarily raw materials needed by industry, things like palm oil, peanuts, gum arabic, beeswax, hides, and rubber. And then other natural products such as ivory, gold, cloves, ostrich feathers, and so on. Now the question is, what's the impact of that going to be on West Africa? There was a scholar named Tony Hopkins, and he had a theory called the crisis of adaptation. And this is kind of summed up in your textbook then on page 173. I'll read it to you here. In all West African states, the end of the slave trade caused political and economic upheavals as a century-old trade ground to a halt. That's what Hopkins argued, saying that these states would be in a crisis trying to adapt to new economic circumstances. Most of the time, though, that's not true. Okay? We can look at example after example and see that's not what happened. Okay? We can look at one example here from the area that's known as the Gold Coast. And that's this coastal area of what is today the country of Ghana. Back in the day, it was called the Gold Coast. Why? Because they produced gold. Okay? And we can chart gold exports from this area. Look at European trade. Okay, from 1651 to 1700, Europeans buy 1.5 million ounces of gold. Then during the era of the slave trade, that drops. It's 1.2 million ounces. And then during the height of the slave trade from this area, 800,000 ounces. But as the slave trade's ending, what happens? More gold gold exports increase. Okay? Why? Well, people there, instead of exporting slaves, start producing and selling more gold. A successful adaptation to the ending of the slave trade. Right? Now, I do have to tell you, it's successful adaptation for the state there, the Ashanti state. It's not necessarily a successful adaptation for some of the people, though, because what the Ashanti did was, instead of sending slaves into the Atlantic world, they kept them locally. They made them mine gold and clear forests and things like that. So the upshot, at least in this area, was an increase in slavery locally, even if it is a decrease of slaves sent into and across the Atlantic. Okay, let me give you another example here. And that's the state of Niue here on the north bank of the Gambia River. Okay, because the other thing your textbook says that I think is not right is on 196, where they say a less positive appraisal of the situation during legitimate commerce would highlight the fact that there was no real change in the distribution of wealth in Africa. The very people who benefited from the slave trade were generally well placed to reorient their efforts to controlling the new legitimate commerce. Well, that's not entirely true, and it depends on where you look. And if we look in this place and time, let me reach over here and get something to show you. It's definitely not true because of what they exported. They didn't export gold from here. What did they export? Well, the first part of the 19th century, they exported this. What is this? This is a 1 pound block of beeswax. And the English and other Europeans used this in industrial processes as well as making candles and so on. And the people in this area produced and exported hundreds of thousands of pounds of beeswax. Who made this? Who gathered beeswax and produced and cleaned it and shipped it out? It was the common people, peasant farmers. Okay, so when they got paid, they collected the money, or more importantly, what they got paid with a lot of times were guns. They would in turn use those guns to overthrow their rulers, who had become corrupt and out of touch. So what they say about the common people not having opportunities at this time isn't entirely true. It depends on where you look. Let me give you another example. We're not going to look at that. Here we go. One of the major goods, at least, that the British are going to buy in West Africa is palm oil. The oil from palm trees. I talked about this basically week 2 when we looked at different things produced in rainforest areas. It's oil from palm trees. It's, let me see, there we go. There's palm trees. These are the fruits of palm trees, and they produce this oil, which is a type of vegetable oil, and it's very good for a number of things, including you can make candles out of it. It's important in certain manufacturing of tin cans. You can produce glycerin from it, which is used in medicine. It's a lubricant in some of these industries, including railway cars. You have to lubricate or grease the axles on those, and palm oil is the perfect thing to do that. It's also a raw material for the manufacture of soap. And part of industrialization is people, developing better personal hygiene, certainly, and using more soap. So in Britain in 1801, in England, they were using 3.5 pounds of soap per person per year. 50 years later, that had doubled. And what are they using? How are they making a soap? They're using palm oil. And because of that, then, the palm oil exports boom. In 1800, the British are buying just under 4,500 pounds of oil from the area of mostly what is coastal Nigeria today. But as you can see, decade by decade, it just increases. And by the 1880s, it's 40 million pounds. Okay? That represents African, entrepreneurship and ingenuity in producing these goods that were needed in Europe. In the case of palm oil actually, there's two kinds of oil in palm oil. There's the oil from the fruit here, and there's also palm kernel oil. Palm kernel oil was produced primarily by women. So what we see is this change from legitimate commerce not only benefited common people, it also benefited certain stratas of society, like women in the palm oil producing areas. So what your textbook has to say is mostly right, but it's not true everywhere. Okay, it's not true that states, were a total upheaval when this transition happened. And it's also not true that only elites benefited from this. Okay, in the case of Numi here, after about 1850, beeswax isn't as important anymore. They're going to start growing peanuts. And peanuts are wanted for their oil, just like palm oil. You can use it to make things. but it's not a traditional crop there, and the king and the rulers couldn't tax it. So all the money goes to the common people. So it's actually not put my beeswax away here. So it's actually not as dramatic a change in many ways as your textbook makes out. Certainly not as dramatic as the changes that are going to come under European invasion and colonial rule, which is what we'll see coming up in a couple of weeks or so. Okay, I'm going to stop there and try to keep it short as promised. Thank you.